Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thank you so much to our panelists for being here. So we're going to talk about homelessness, which is just such a huge problem in San Francisco. It seems like everywhere you go, you see people who are homeless, and it's been a lot of money spent, and we still haven't figured out how to solve the problem. So, Tamika, let's start with you. You hear a lot of the time that there's homelessness because there's not enough housing being built. Is that the whole problem, or is there something else going on that people are missing?
Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and thanks y'all for coming to hear us all talk about this stuff that we work on every day. I think that housing is a fundamental element in solving homelessness. It's really difficult to deal with any of the issues that you face in your life without having a home. And I personally think it's a fundamental right, and we should really be thinking about how do we communicate public policy that doesn't commoditize housing. So I'm gonna just start there. But no, it's not the only issue. I think we live in one of the highest cost regions in the world. And we have a system that treats homelessness as if it's an isolated problem, when in fact it's the result of many failed systems that feed folks experiencing homelessness every single day. So for every family that we serve at Hamilton Families, each month, 22 new families experience homelessness. And so the inflow of what happens if it's an economic crisis, if it's a health crisis, if you had lost your job or couldn't take your child to school, all of those life moments that we all experience destabilize folks very quickly. After the recession, San Francisco experienced a spike in family homelessness. We had almost 1,200 students in our district who were experiencing homelessness. So every night, 1,200 kids, 1 in 25 students in the district were homeless. And so we've been working really hard to disrupt a number of folks and families who are experiencing homelessness. And as we house, we've housed over 550 families over the last year, and now we have 2,000 students in the school district who are experiencing homelessness. Mm-hmm. So it's really difficult to think that housing is the only solution when folks don't have access to livable wage jobs in the Bay Area that allow them to pay their rent, pay their child care, pay for transportation costs, et cetera. And I think that there is a real disconnect between how these systems integrate with one another to actually respond to someone's whole life experience and have a comprehensive response.
So, Carrie, you had a very personal experience with homelessness. You were actually living on the streets mm-hmm. and actually ran into the organization you now work for. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what caused you to be homeless and what were some of the obstacles to finding a place to live?
So, my reason for homelessness was my addiction. I had my mental health and my addiction was pretty much what was driving me. I had my 3-year-old daughter. I had some depression, and so I was using substances to kind of counter or balance that. But so I was a client at HPP years and years and years ago. I've been actually working for HPP for about 12 years now. They supported me when I was pregnant and got me stabilized in public housing with going through the family shelter system. And then once I was stabilized and was working on myself, I went in and they have a job opportunity where you learn skills. It's a community health worker program, and it's a year-long training program. And so I went through that and learned some computer skills, learned skills of supporting families, and then actually HPP sent me to school, and I started working as an intensive case manager and outreach worker in the wellness department. So I worked very closely with pregnant women that were out on the streets, homeless, substance use, mental health. And so I worked as an outreach worker and a health educator and case manager for that particular population, and worked closely with the other support, like General Hospital, all the different hospitals and social workers, and I would try to get moms connected. And my experience being homeless and being a substance user helped give me a little bit more insight and gaining trust with these clients, because they're dealing with a lot of shame, guilt, grappling with their addiction, their mental health. And so helping them with gaining trust, it was a big thing. And
so it's, yeah, it sounds like some of the kind of additional solutions or resources that Tamika is talking about were part of what helped you stabilize and you know, get a job, et cetera.
Yeah, and going to school and actually having the agency, Martha Ryan, and they supported me in finding myself, you know, and finding my like true north. And seeing that in me helped empower me and encourage me to continue going, gave me some worth.
So, Amina, you had a different experience. You were one of the many people coming out of prison who had to look for housing. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the challenges of coming out of incarceration and having to find a stable place to live?
Definitely. So yes, after spending 15 years in prison, paroling to San Francisco, which happens to basically have like one of few transitional homes for women, which is a dual diagnosis substance abuse treatment program. And a lot of, I can only speak for long-termers because I was serving a life sentence. So most people in prison who get out serving a life sentence, it is recommended that they parole to a transitional home. However, there's not really re-entry homes for people serving long periods of time. So we're talking about anywhere from 15 to 40 years in prison. They spend most of that time taking substance abuse treatment programs, domestic violence classes, and all of these cognitive behavioral therapy classes, but to get out and be right back in those settings was kind of like discouraging, but that's all that was to offer. So folks normally spend 6 months to a year in those programs and then move on to a sober living home. Although a lot of folks are not suffering from substance abuse treatment, that's the only programs available. But it does afford you a little time to save money to be able to go out and find an apartment in one of the the expensive city in the world. If it wasn't for my partner and husband, I wouldn't be able to afford to live in the city, coupled with the fact that I have a past criminal conviction. I know a lot of folks who are like hindered from finding housing because of their past criminal record. In addition to employment barriers. So there's just barriers on top of barriers, like the inequality of income, having a prior criminal conviction just compounds and makes it nearly impossible to find housing here in the city.
So if you have a criminal record, you can't live in public housing, you might have a really hard time finding a job. What can you do to find housing? Is there any solution out there?
Basically, you're going to find a roommate. So there are resources. San Francisco does have resources, you know, and, you know, they have like the lottery program, but it's much like the California lottery. You know, you will be, you'll study, you know, and a lot of folks, like for me, I know I didn't want to live communal living. You know what I'm saying? I wanted my own spot. I wanted my own place to live, you know, a place to lay my head where I can think at night. So, I mean, thank God for me, I had a husband who is willing to, you know, share the cost with me. So a lot of folks, that's what they have to do is like find other supporters or peers to, you know, room with in order to live here in the city or transfer parole to a less expensive county.
So one of the things that's most interesting to me is that we live in California, which is one of the most, you know, progressive states in the country. We're always ahead of things on policy. San Francisco is a very progressive city, and yet we have this huge problem with homelessness. Tamika, what's going on here? Why is San Francisco specifically really not able to solve this right now?
Well, you know, I think that this is a conversation about race and justice, and you can't think about this in the context of not understanding the structural racism that perpetuates the outcomes that we see all the time. You know, it's as if it's a brand new conversation every time someone says, wow, San Francisco only has 4% African-American population, but 40% of the folks experiencing homelessness are African-American. And so I think when we can have a real honest conversation about why those trends and realities continue to perpetuate themselves, I think that's when we can actually start looking at culturally responsive treatment and services. If people don't have services provided necessarily by people that look like them or have experiences that they can relate to, it's often really difficult for folks to feel like they're going to get the benefit of what's available to them. I also think that if we aren't, San Francisco is an incredibly progressive city. The Bay Area is an incredibly progressive place, but we have humans suffering in our community. And so how do we justify our desire to say we want shelter and homes for poor and homeless folks, but I don't want them next to my house in my community? Those are contradictory realities that don't yield homes and options for everybody in our community. And so until we're able to test those narratives and actually say, well, where are the people going to go? Where do they live? Because I think you can easily dehumanize poor and homeless folks and be like, they don't need the same elements that I needed to prosper in my own life. They need a different path. Yet there are no paths for folks to actually lift themselves out of poverty and prosper because our system doesn't expect them to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Amina, have you found a way to talk to people making policy or, people on the street and say, this is why we should be, doing some of the things that Tamika said, thinking about building housing everywhere so people can live across the city, making sure that there are policies catered to certain types of people or certain, people on the streets, I guess.
Definitely. So, yeah, legal services, prisoners, children, all of us or none. That's who we mostly work for, formerly incarcerated and those incarcerated, and a whole bunch of other coalitions that also, work for the restoration of human and civil rights for formerly incarcerated folks. And all of us or none in 2004 passed a fair chance ban the box for employment and later housing, which is also, has also been a barrier, that box on the rental application asking if you've been convicted of a felony and being discriminated against. And sometimes, it doesn't even take the box. You'd be discriminated on because of the color of your skin. But passing legislation that will open doors and have equal housing opportunities for folks with criminal convictions. And we are currently trying to implement a statewide policy for surrounding housing for folks convicted of past criminal convictions.
So we've seen a little bit of action on the policy front with housing in San Francisco this year with Prop C being passed. There's who knows if if the funds are ever going to see the light of day. They could spend a lot of time in court. But Carrie, I'm wondering, if you had infinite resources, how would you spend that to solve the problem of pregnant women being homeless?
That's like a nice. So I would open up another shelter, another supportive family shelter, where the focus could be on the immediate getting any pregnant woman off the streets and in a wraparound care of getting prenatal care, because that would be one of the first important things besides other supportive services for mental health and addiction and working on the basics for them, because they're living in a certain community and a lifestyle that's pretty hard, and there's a lot of trauma that happens, and again, they're still thinking about, like, I don't want to be hurting my child, my baby, and working against all of that guilt and shame. So giving them a safe place to stop, breathe, be able to have an option to all the like the supportive stuff, and work through their pregnancy with love and care, and then working on helping them develop what they want to do. HPP pretty much does all of that. The housing pieces, or getting the pregnant moms that are immediately on the streets is really important, and helping with the development of their baby. The first 3 months is one of the most important parts of the development, and our system as it's set up in the coordinated entry is that you really don't get on a list unless you're 5 months and high risk. And then, or 7 months before they can kind of cycle you into getting stabilized. So the idea would be just to any pregnant woman with high risk, getting them off the streets would be, giving them a bed to start working on those issues.
Well, Tamika, I know you said, if you had all the money in the world, that would be great, but there are also some policy changes that need to happen, specifically within San Francisco, to make it easier to talk to people who are homeless and kind of help them find the resources they need. What kind of changes would you make if you were in charge?
Well, I think part of the challenge that we have in trying to solve homelessness is that the systems are actually just designed to maintain homelessness. Most of the time, systems work exactly the way they are designed. And so we have that reality across this country. It's not just San Francisco's challenge. So I think we have to work together to figure out what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve. How do we actually customize a system that has responses for people who are experiencing very different things? Homelessness is not monolithic. Every part of human work and social service work over my career for the last 25 years, and the reason it's hard and nobody actually wants to do it is because every human is different. Right? And so how do you design public policy where you're trying to get the most support from the most people, but you have so much nuance in people experiencing homelessness? So I think we need a much more customized response in figuring out, what does someone actually need? How do we and talk to the people who need it? So often, as a public policy person who's spent time in government for the last 15 years, we go to the people, we say, so what do you need? And the people tell us over and over again, and then we be like, ooh, I'm gonna create a system that does nothing about what you need. We gotta stop doing that. Let the people tell us, and let's try it. We don't have very much to lose if we aren't co-creating with folks with lived experiences around ways in which to end homelessness. Homelessness feels intractable, but it actually is solvable. And so if we don't have that mentality in the way that we approach public policy, then we're actually not going to solve it. So I think we have to do some shifts, not only around resource allocation, but process and conversations that look at a more comprehensive response to people who are experiencing homelessness.
Well, I'm going to throw it to the audience for questions. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and someone with a mic will come around and give you their microphone.
Hi, I'm Quiver Watts with the Street Sheet newspaper. I talked to a lot of, sort of to your last point about having more specific services. I talked to a lot of trans people who fear going into the shelters because they've experienced abuse both from other clients and from shelter staff. And so I'm wondering if there are any projects that are underway or goals for the future to make trans people feel more welcome and safe in shelters.
Tamika, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. We work really closely with Larkin Street Youth Services at the Crossroads, many organizations that are really focused particularly on our LGBTQ youth. Young people are actually 45% of the homeless population in our city. So we actually have a really significant challenge for folks feeling safe. They're fleeing communities where they are coming to San Francisco for safety and support. And we need to be able to, again, customize our services to be responsive to what a trans young person might be experiencing. And that's sort of the customization I'm talking about. Most young people actually don't identify themselves as homeless. So if you go out as an outreach worker or you do an assessment and you say, well, are you homeless? They're going to say no, because there might be doubled and tripled up with a friend, or they might be moving from Oakland to Contra Costa. So how do we sort of adapt our language and communication with folks who have lived experiences and do more targeted support around those particular individuals? And I think Larkin and others are really aware of that and recognize that as the best practice to see change for folks.
Great.
Yeah.
We have a question up here in the front. She's just coming with the mic.
My name's Rachel. I work with Jail Health Reentry Services in the psych department. And I used to be a case manager at the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. And I know that there's been a lot of investment in shelters and in short-term housing for homeless people, but I'm interested in like how you think we can get more permanent housing for people and how we can improve the conditions of the current permanent housing, the SROs in particular. I've been to a number of the different ones through different agencies, and I have to say Hamilton Families is one of the nicest, best facilities that I've seen for formerly homeless people. But, you know, just the experience I had at Tenderloin Housing Clinic, filled with roaches. I had tenants actually turn their keys into me and say, I'd rather be homeless than live here. And so I want to know, how can we make it so that where we're sending people isn't somewhere that they'd rather be on the streets than there?
Well, Tamika, I guess the question is, how did you make Hamilton so nice?
Well, thanks for that shout out. I mean, I think part of it is that we treat folks with dignity and respect, right? And when we have amazing staff in Hamilton who recognize that the quality of your experience allows you to free up from the trauma that you're experiencing to be able to move from your situation. And so we do have a shelter shortage. I want to be really transparent about that. We have not actually invested in shelter in the city for quite some time because permanent supportive housing, which is a higher needs, much more expensive housing stock, is really important. We know that there's a lot of success in that. And San Francisco actually produces the largest amount of permanent supportive housing than any jurisdiction in the country. And it's still not enough. Right. And so part of it is, how do we work with our public systems? How do we work with private landlords to set expectations? And, you know, what are the carrots and sticks to hold people accountable about the quality of the housing so that we can actually have people not choosing to be in a tent rather than in our shelters or in temporary housing? So I think the mayor is actually very clear about trying to add some shelter capacity to the system, but also hearing from folks with lived experiences about the design of that shelter. They want to be able to bring their pets. Folks want to be able to have partners. They don't necessarily want curfews. So how do we do low barrier responses to our emergency housing system that allows people to feel comfortable and to feel safe? So I think that that's part of the strategy.
Great. Well, Tamika, Carrie, and Amina, thank you so much for your time. This was a really great panel.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Great job.